Oh, we're still hearing a little audio dripping in there. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be, and welcome to episode 34 of Chart Chat. My name is Steve Wexler. I'm the founder, principal, and sole employee of Data Revelations, and one of the hosts here. And joining me is, and let me pass this to Andy Cotgreave.
Hello, everybody. Andy Cotgreave, Senior Data Evangelist at Tableau, currently on sabbatical. So coming to you chilled from Oxford. Great to be here with you all today. I'll pass it over to Jeff.
Jeff Shaffer from Cincinnati, Ohio, where I am a professor at the University of Cincinnati teaching data visualization and descriptive analytics, and chief operating officer at a fintech in Cincinnati. And I'll pass it to Amanda.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Makulec. I'm the Executive Director of the Data Visualization Society and a Health Data Visualization Designer. Excited to be here today joining you from Washington, D.C. And I will pass it back over to Steve to introduce our special guest for today's Chart Chat.
Yes, indeed, we have Philip Bump here, a national correspondent from and columnist and commentator from the Washington Post. Philip, we'll hear from you in a sec. Let me just share what we're going to be doing and talking about. Chart Chat is an attempt to resurrect the debates and discussions we had around writing the big book of dashboards. Since a year and a half ago, we had Amanda join us. You are encouraged to join the debate and the discussion respectfully. If you disagree with things or have other ideas, please share them in the comments or join us for the after party. Speaking of which, so here is our agenda for today. We're going to meet Philip Bump and find out the inspiration for his really wonderful data visualization-based newsletter, How to Read This Chart. And in fact, we will do a deep dive on one of the newsletters and look at some of the charts in one of them. Then people have commented repeatedly how much they enjoy us taking on makeover, where here's this presentation, here's this visualization. How would you show it differently? So I don't know where you found that, Philip, but and your discovery of vintage data visualizations, but you'll tell us about that in a little bit. Then we'll shift a little bit and see how you use data and visualization to buttress a lot of your columns. If you follow Philip, and I think you should, see that he is producing some thoroughly researched stuff on pretty much a daily basis. Then we'll have a discussion with Amanda, Jeff, and Andy about the Information is Beautiful Awards. And boys, that was their pent-up demand for that. And we will finish with the legendary after party, where you are welcome to join us and share your thoughts on what we've discussed. But with that, Philip, if you wouldn't mind, can you tell us a little bit about you, your background, and what got you started doing this?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's fun as you see this screen up, which is the intro to How to Read This Chart. And I always start with this joke. And so the first thing that jumped out at me is, did Mr. Met forward this to you? And so I was very distracted by that, because then I had to think about the horrible week that the Mets have had and all these various emotional thoughts have already flooded through my brain. So, hi, Philip Bump from the Washington Post. I have this newsletter, as you can see, How to Read This Chart. The goal of the newsletter is to present to people who may not be terribly enthusiastic about or familiar with different sort of data visualizations, show them some things that they may not have seen, some new styles of charts, some interesting charts, and present to them a sense of what you can do with data visualizations and why data visualizations are not something that you should just throw up your hands at if it's not something you're used to. I strongly suspect everyone who's watching this right now probably is already on board with us, this sort of collective sense of what data visualizations can do. Perhaps not. Anyway, it's a newsletter aimed at that. And that was an offshoot of the work that I've been doing at the Post. I've been at the Post now for more than 8 years, which is sort of remarkable. And one of the things that I do is I use data to try and help tell the stories about what's happening in the news. So, for example, this morning I made a little visualization that looks at research which shows that what people remember about the January 6th attack at the Capitol is colored by their partisanship. So I made a little interactive about that, and there's a chart that I lifted out of the research for that. And so it's just a very obviously recent example in my mind of ways in which you can use data visualization and present data in different ways beyond just text in order to tell a story. But this is what I've been doing at the Post for more than 8 years now. Prior to that, I worked for the Atlantic Wire, which was basically the Atlantic's news blog, if you will. Prior to that, I worked at Grist, which is an environmental site. But I've had my own website for 22 years now. I started a blog back in 2000. Which was running on Perl, and it was all hand coded. This is before even the blogger days. Back, I went to Ohio State. God bless our Ohio universities, but I went to Ohio State and worked in a computer lab from midnight to 8 a.m. It was a great job because no one ever came in. Computer labs. It's so funny. I went back to Ohio State a couple of years ago, and I was like, oh, I'm going to go look at the computer lab where I worked. And of course, there is no computer lab in Ohio State anymore. Everyone has their own computers. You don't need to go to a computer lab. But in the early 1990s, you did. And so I spent 8 hours a night learning. The web was new, and I learned HTML, and I learned how to do really rudimentary coding, and that really sent me on this trajectory of combining interest in data and interest in presentation about things with sharing my views on things, which essentially is what I've done since. And that is what I try and do with the Washington Post. I try and not only provide to readers insights into what's happening in the news, but to do so through a quantitative lens that they might not otherwise get. So that's that. Then after having repeated what is this scatter plot? How do I read this? I was like, the hell with it. Let's do a newsletter and let's make all this stuff much more accessible. And it's great because I get a lot of feedback from folks that are, this isn't native to me, and I appreciate you doing this. I try and make it fun and entertaining read. My guideline is always, does my mother appreciate it? And often she does, not always.
Well, I'm going to share one of your newsletters now. And also I couldn't help looking on LinkedIn and seeing the background and noting that you were at Adobe for a while, but we can maybe discuss that at some point. I don't know which of us was the first to discover your newsletter, but we quickly shared it with anyone and everyone we knew. And so here is something that came in several weeks ago. And I mean, there's a lot of rich stuff in here. And my apologies to my chart chat chums if I'm not going to stop on the thing you would have liked to have discussed on this. But, this looks interesting, and what is talking about here? But I remember seeing, this was interesting.
That was good.
Game leaderboard thing, and this is totally bogus. Sorry. Hey, you're just going to have to subscribe to the newsletter or read the back newsletters if you want to see what that one's about. This is the one that caught my eye. And I guess it's because it has the pink beigey background, so it's from the Financial Times. And further looking at it, we see it's from John Burton Murdoch. And I had to pause and think about it for a little bit. What is this thing trying to show me? And then I also have a question for Andy about the color usage, but hold on a sec. I'll let me have a larger version of this. And Philip, what caught your eye? Why did you decide to showcase this, and what do you think's great about it?
Yeah, so what I look for charts that I use in news. I mean, this one wasn't really highlighted. It's part of what I created this thing called Chart for Read, which is basically when I'm feeling lazy and I see things that I like, but I've already got something else planned for the week and I just want to throw it out there. So I didn't spend a lot of time in this one, but what I liked about it is, obviously Burton Murdoch's a great designer and he does a lot of good stuff. But the first thing is aesthetically, it's a very pleasing to look at chart. I'm a sucker for opacity on charts, which is, I think in this audience I can say that without sounding like a total nerd. But I like the presentation of it, and I think that it makes a valuable point about British politics, which I'm confident, although can't prove, translates into American politics as well. And so, it shows how the Conservative Party in particular has moved away from where its voters are over time in a way that the Labour Party hasn't, or in a way at least that the Labour Party, it is more distant from sort of the collective sentiment of the British people than is the Labour Party. So I think it is informative in that regard. But honestly, I chose it because I just think it's sharp, and I think it rewards actually looking at it a little more closely.
Mm. What was the question you had for me, Steve?
Are those colors do you immediately see a color in politics the way we here in the United States do and go, oh, yes, that's that group of people because it's this color? Are the colors used consistently to identify parties in Great Britain as they are in the United States?
Yes. So one of the endless challenges of being a political junkie is realizing that in the UK, blue is conservative and sort of the right-wing side of the political spectrum, and red is Labour and the left-wing side of the spectrum, which is the inverse to your American color scheme. It was interesting that it took me a while to pass this chart because the colors are transparent and not as saturated as you would normally see them. I actually didn't make the color association at all. I really enjoyed the need to read and work out what this chart was showing before getting the understanding. And I think that's a really important way of creating a powerful chart, because sometimes if you invest the time in working out what's being shown, you actually get much more out than you might with a half a second chart. So yes, the colors represent the parties, and yellow are Lib Dems too. It's fascinating as well, the power of language at the top. The FT, that they're completely unmoored from British public on economics and are way out of step. A right-wing paper could show the same chart and say the Conservatives have finally broken free and are pushing voters forwards into a brighter future. That title is so important, and you can tell what paper these things are coming from, also from just from the wording of the title and the adjectives.
Jeff or Amanda, any thoughts?
Well, I'm a big fan of John Byrne Murdoch. He's been a guest on Chart Chat, and I love the design. So always a fan to see what he has going on. I would say if I didn't have opacity on this, I'm not sure it would really work, right? I mean, Philip said he's a sucker for it, but I think that's kind of key to me as to seeing the overlap, because if you don't have that, you're really not going to see where these intersections kind of do overlap. And so I thought it was just kind of the right amount, right? So it's sort of, for me, the right amount of color, but the right amount of opacity to get the point across.
I still will admit that I actually don't entirely understand when I look at this chart what the values are that are encoded on it. I keep looking for like a legend, for example, on what the size means, because I have such a mental model of looking for how these different things are encoding different pieces of information. And there's information valued or encoded down in the bottom in the footnote. But I actually found this to be a really hard chart to read, and one that I still didn't entirely make sense of, because it didn't have, it kind of seems like one of those things that gives you a general idea. It's a very kind of relative chart or a very generic chart showing an overall shift, not something that points to a specific number, which is apparent by not having the axes labeled. It's one of those kind of quadrant graphics. So it's interesting conceptually as a graphic. It doesn't have the same kind of quantitative weight that I oftentimes associate with the work that John does. So I found this to actually be a really challenging chart to make sense of.
Yeah, it doesn't show its work.
Yeah, I find it's an interesting choice, because each blob is where voters live on authoritarian and left-wing scales. And so they're hard edged, they've got the border is an even bolder color, so it implies this perfection, and yet really what it's showing is something that is vague and unmeasurable. I get that can be challenging. I quite liked it as a conceptual chart. I read it as a conceptual chart rather than one portraying accuracy, which the solid lines might portray.
Are the Lib Dem voters the smallest group? Is that part of the sizing component here in terms of the size?
No, so the size of the blob is the spread of
the views.
Right? So if you look at what's the easiest one? So if you look at Labour, Labour leans quite far to the left. So most voters are either very left-wing or somewhat left-wing. So that's the horizontal extent. And then the vertical extent is that they're mostly libertarian at the bottom and then a little bit at the top. It doesn't represent the size of the number of voters at all.
It's funny how the mental models we have of what things like size are kind of force us to jump to conclusions about trying to figure out how those things are mapped in here, even if they're not actually present.
Well, Philip, you realize the four of us, we are all professional chart looker-atters. And if something makes us pause and think, wait a second, what is this trying to show? It's worth commenting on, especially something that's coming from the Financial Times and Vern Murdoch.
Right.
Before we move on, Philip, any other comments you have on this?
Yeah, two things. I think one of the things that's nice about the chart pourri thing that I do with the newsletter is that it's almost like additional homework, right? And I don't want to frame it that way because it sounds like it's an encumbrance, but it really is just like, here's something that I think is interesting, take a look at it, right? And I don't necessarily spend a lot of time doing the, titular how to read it. It is rather just like, here's something that I think is worth consideration. So I think that's valuable. I do want to say too, I'm sure this topic has come up before on Chart Chat. I find it hard to believe it hasn't, but I have written in the past about the really interesting evolution in America's use of red and blue and how it really started to sort of collapse into the standard in 2000. That itself is an interesting story. I assume probably people have gone to Dave Leap's U.S. Election Atlas, which is a really good resource for historic election data. If you haven't, you should check it out. But he is really, really adamant about using blue for Republicans and red for Democrats because that's how it's always been. And so all of the charts on his site, all the maps on his site are really hard to read at first because it uses the inverse along the lines of what we see here. But that whole story itself, I think, is completely fascinating.
We haven't done that discussion before, so that would be interesting to follow up on.
Sorry, go ahead, Amanda.
Well, I've got a question, Philip. You slightly alluded to it in your introduction, and I'm interested in how chart pourri impacts these things. But what was the actual catalyst to start the newsletter, and who are you writing for, and are you getting sort of feedback from the non-professional chart lookerators that it's breaking through?
No, it's funny, and I will be completely honest with you. So I wrote a book, and the book is coming out in January. And so the catalyst was I want to have a newsletter to help promote the book. So that was why I started it. It's been going for about a year now. But what I wanted to do with it was I knew the book was going to be heavy on charts, which it is. It's got 130 some odd charts in it over the course of 400 pages. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to use that as a way to talk about this thing that I knew had come up repeatedly, to my point earlier. It is the case that a lot of people, I put something in a post and people come back and are like, I don't understand what this means. And, I really do want to increase that literacy. But, the prompt was I have a book and I wanted to push people toward that as well.
Cool. Look forward to seeing the book.
I was just trying to get it queued up quickly. Here we go. So we're gonna plug this later, Philip. But we'll plug it now as well.
But if you're gonna buy it, which I hope people do want to buy it, but if you're gonna buy it, I think we're supposed to wait until like closer to when it comes out. The Viking has a very specific strategy about this, so there it is. And I hope that people are interested in it. And I probably shouldn't shy people away from it, but I don't know how to do it. I've never done this before. But
fair enough. Well, you mentioned that the chart pourri was you're saying you're kind of, laziness and goodness, reading your columns and reading the newsletter, you are anything but lazy. But here's another one that from, I guess, one of your colleagues at the Washington Post, and it's about wealth inequality in the United States. And what caught your eye, and what do you think about this? And then I'll ask my colleagues the same thing. And then the rabbit hole that you can go on with this particular tweet and people commenting on it. So, Philip?
The reason I like this chart is another thing I like about data visualization is when data visualization actually obscures the point they're trying to make. When you're trying to, when you show that something is uncommon by making it hard to see in data visualization. So in the past, I've done, for example, visualizations of voter fraud, right? So you have this giant square which represents the mass of people that voted in an election, and then you have 2 by 2 pixels up in the corner, which represents articulated or demonstrated examples of voter fraud. And the point of that is not that you're showing voter fraud, it is you're showing how rare this thing is. You're showing how hard it is to actually see that. And that's Stein's point here, right? Is that when we're talking about family wealth, half the country is that little really hard to distinguish from the x-axis baseline there. That is half the country. That's the wealth that they hold. And that it is hard to see is the point, which is why I like this chart.
Andy, Jeff, Amanda, any comments?
It's a great chart, and yeah, visualizing the tiny things is always a great aspect of visualization. It's I might have highlighted the bottom half if I was going to make this chart myself and used this, made it pop out, even though it's a tiny thin sliver. But
well, I will say in Jeff's defense, I think we're sort of 2 steps removed. He saw the chart, you know, and then I elevated his tweet about it. So yeah,
understood.
But my issue with it is that the bottom 50% is actually decreasing relative to the upper, and I might have shown this as a percent of the total. And but by the way, the rabbit hole that you can then go down with this. So you know, this extra credit or this extra homework that you described, if you actually click these things, you end up going down the Twitter rabbit hole, and then hey, we're back at John Byrne Murdoch again, and trying to show that the 90th percentile in the United States, he has it broken down by 5th, 10th, 50th, 90th, etc. A 97th percentile, and that things have really not increased for people in the United States, but for people who are very wealthy, it's been a massive increase. And likewise, people will start citing this is wonderful YouTube video from, oh gosh, why can't I remember the who produced this, but you can just look up wealth inequality in America on YouTube and you will find it. It's got 25 million views and it's pretty potent stuff. Any other comments on either this or the whole rabbit hole? This somewhat difficult to parse, but I think really well done.
Tim Beard has quite a good one about the previous slide.
yeah.
The black color choice.
The brown. I think the brown. Yeah.
I will say that I would agree with Andy that one of the tricky things I find is that it does really blend in so much with the kind of baseline color of what I'd assume an axis to be, and is so hard to parse, especially in a small tile, that I'm really grateful that it's in the tweet, kind of calling attention to it and where it exists. Otherwise, you kind of sit there wondering where it disappeared to.
It's just that we've literally talked about this for 2 minutes and we've gone, you could show it as a stacked bar, you could show it as a stacked percentage bar. Guylan in the chat says you could show a slope chart with wealth and population numbers on a sort of slope chart. And every chart's a compromise. That's the whole point of what we do here. And you've got to make your decision and publish something at some point. Knowing
along the lines of Galen, I was thinking we had a conversation a few episodes back about a proportion plot, and that would show, with a stack on one side, stack on the other, and kind of the proportion of the difference, because I think what's in the text of this message is the bottom part of that chart is half the country, right? We don't have any visual to see that. And if you had a proportion plot going from one side to the other, it might show, hey, this little tiny thing is every, half the country.
Exactly. It's hard to see that this is, well, that looks like way more than 10% over here. No, it's so... How do you show that this tiny group of people has this much wealth? I do encourage people to look at that YouTube video. I will find the author of it shortly. Anyone else have a comment on this or the rabbit hole associated with it? And we can look at one of the historical visualizations that Philip found in another newsletter. So let me move on to that and give me a moment to cue that up, and we'll go through some of our makeover stuff. There we go. And here's another how to read this chart newsletter. And this caught my eye immediately. And what is this odd looking item? Let me show it a little larger for people here. Well, Philip, why don't you just lead us on this and explain what this is and how on earth you found it.
Sure. So this is, I'm going to start sort of not by answering your question, but one of the things that I love to do in the newsletter is to highlight old charts. And there's 2 reasons for that. First is that, all these things exist in the pre-internet dark age, printed on paper in various places. And there's so much good stuff out there that you can elevate. I've, in recent weeks, I've sort of gone down a little rabbit hole of my own in terms of elevating some old stuff. I found this old map of CBS radio station coverage from like the 1930s. It's just gorgeous. And just to think about the process that you had to use back then to make this thing makes it worth elevating all by itself. So I like it from that standpoint. But that chart actually, one of the things that happens with some regularity is people just email me things. And so this guy who'd written a book called Zipper that is about the history of the zipper, fascinating one, sent in. He said, hey, look, I used this. He had lifted it from somewhere, I forget where, but he used it in his book, and he sent me a picture of it. And so I just took the picture that he'd sent me and dropped it in the newsletter. And it is a depiction of the change in the use of buttons to fasten one's pants versus zippers over time among graduate classes at Princeton University. And Steve, I know you've actually you dug into this a little bit more. But it was for a variety of reasons that I articulate in the newsletter. I just found this just really, really a great visualization to consider, both for presentation and actual representation.
And what did you take issue with it? How did,
Sure.
and you have done a couple makeovers of this, which do I have your permission to share them?
Yeah, they're in the newsletter. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, anything you want to immediately call out on this, to start with?
Yeah, and people may not be able to see, but what's interesting is if you look at this, recognizing that this is a very old, chart. This is not recent. So we sort of have expectations about data visualizations which may not be applied at the time. Yeah, 1940. There you go. But looking at this, it looks as though zippers are declining over time and buttons increasing. And obviously, that's not what happened. The inverse is the case. And you can see at the bottom there, this is referring to graduating classes, the class of 1904, 1914, 1919, et cetera. And so they asked those graduating classes the extent to which they used buttons or zippers. And then they presented them in what we would consider, I think, reverse chronological order, going from the newest class to the oldest class. And so this is not meant to be read exactly. This is not meant to be read left to right so much as it is just a presentation of the values. But by reading it right to left, you understand that we're looking at the decline of buttons and the increase in zippers. Yes. And so I made this, which used the same data. Granted, I sort of estimated where the columns landed. But this, I think, makes the point a lot more clearly. And then, just to try and be cute, I used my Adobe Illustrator skills garnered at my stint at Adobe and actually made little buttons and little zippers using the wonderful Noun project, which lets you use, has vector art that you can use for visualizations.
And love that you kind of cite that in your chart creation there.
Right. Well, they asked that you do so, but I probably would anyway. Yes.
Can I call out something I really loved about actually this version of the chart that Philip did compared to the other one, which is that the cut off kind of truncated buttons are at the bottom instead of floating at the top. It just makes the whole kind of visualization of using the buttons in the chart so much cleaner. As we think about the really small design decisions we make, especially when we're using iconography in our charts and our graphics, that it seems like little seemingly tiny things like that actually make a huge difference because it creates a much smoother top, that you don't get kind of stuck on the fact that the shape is so different as it gets cut off in different spaces. So as we think about those kind of tiny design decisions, that was something that jumped out to me just on the difference between this chart and the other one. Also, I really prefer the logical chronological timeline.
Amanda, I totally missed that. Nice. Glad you cited it. Any other comments before we now share our makeovers?
I should have shared the data with you so you didn't have to do your own estimations. My apologies. I should have been.
We all trust Steve. Steve provided the data set to all of us.
Yeah, exactly. That was a very painful 3 or 4 minutes, Philip. Well, I'm going to stop sharing this, and I think we have this going Andy, then Amanda, then Jeffrey. So, Andy, you are.
Yeah, right. Okay, so here's the original. I think we're all fans of vintage charts here. And in fact, to plug for next month, we have pretty much signed on the dotted line that next month's chart chat will be featuring RJ Andrews, whose vintage books on vintage data viz from Florence Nightingale and 2 others who I forget will be out in November. So RJ talking about Vintage Viz in 4 weeks' time. Okay, so going through this, I didn't look at Philip's remake when I did these. So let's just see where we got to. First, I tried a slope line. It looks really dull. I thought, oh, change from start to end. Why? Because when you're comparing percentage change, when there's only 2 members in a dimension, you're always going to get an inverted X shape, which is visually really, really uninteresting. As we were just about to go live, Amanda said, Andy, I expect to see a panel of pies. And here it is. Here's the panel of pies. Of course, there's a panel of pies. Just to wind up my co-hosts. Now, I always think it's good to do bad charts just to see maybe what you shouldn't do. I'm going to, in my eternal strive to at least try and defend these things, at least because the zips continually increase, it does create a sense of flow, which perhaps if you animated it, would be an interesting chart, but we're not here to encourage pies. So I thought that's probably not. So they all went in the bin. I went back to, let's try and build a side-by-side in Tableau. Now, side-by-side charts are interesting. They often look really visually jarring. And I think, particularly in Tableau's defaults, there's a lot of borders, there's a lot of column dividers, there's grid lines, and the orange and blue is quite clashing as a contrast. So it's not, you don't get a great side-by-side experience in Tableau. But looking at this, I thought, well, there's buttons and zippers. We're talking about the rise of zippers. I'll just get rid of the buttons. I don't care about, who needs to see buttons? We don't need to see it. So here's the percent rise in buttons. And at this point, I haven't diverted very far from the original chart, but I took the idea again and thought, can we add some visual ornament to a simple bar chart? So I too went to the 9 project. It is amazing. And I really like, with just zips, you get this sense of the zip getting completed. I added this subtle background to show where the buttons are. And I chose black and white because, well, we started in black and white, so I thought I'd continue. And then
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Why didn't you go to 100% on the y-axis, though?
The y-axis is going to.
It's
That's excellent. So I think 84% is So the bar.
You can see on the preceding screen it goes to like 90. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
No.
So the y-axis does go to 100%, but the bar, the top of the bar is probably about where my mouse cursor is now.
Yeah,
so you're seeing the sort of the problem that Stephen Few highlights is when you add loads of guff at the top, people think, oh, look, why is it 84 when it's not? So you caught me out. But that's good, because I did look at this thing. There's quite a lot of decoration on this. What if we just take out the decoration and just sort of re-emphasize the existence of buttons, even keep them grey, and then you got this low ornament version, percentage stacked area bar. So I'm giving you 2 versions because they both, well, apart from this white, I think it's a flaw, the y-axis. I think it's a good one to point out. But I ended up with an ornamental version or an austere stacked area bar, stacked area chart. So there you go. Thoughts in the comments? Thoughts from Philip and my co-host?
Found that issue with the capping the graphic and the top point in terms of what that looks like and where the top of the bar is. Is it the top of the graphic and the icon, or the top of the bar that you can see?
And does it matter?
That is the voice of Stephen Few in my head as well.
But does it matter?
I would say yes.
Okay.
I think it does.
Yeah.
I mean, I think particularly on this one, because it is this comparative, and it doesn't necessarily need to be comparative. I do like your stack version there, but I think because it is comparative, it gives the impression there's only a tiny sliver. But we're still talking about 16%. 1 in 7 or whatever it happens to be, that are still using buttons even at that latter date. So I think there I might have topped the zipper at the top of the bar. Yeah,
I think good point. Excellent.
All right.
So
Andy,
there you go. That's me.
That's outstanding. Amanda.
All right. So Andy and I had a similar thought and similar direction, but I went a little bit different in how I focused on it. So I liked the way that Philip had focused on kind of the zipper idea and the concept in terms of the bar, but also like Andy thought that maybe we didn't need to look at both the zippers and the buttons. The buttons felt distracting to me, so I stacked them and used the zipper as a fill moving up. So focused on that specific component, but kept it at a 100% stack in terms of what the overall perspective looked like. My question that I had was, it started at 0%. So what are some ideas or things? And I don't own, I believe Steve owns a book on this about the history of the zipper. Is that right, Steve? A very detailed book. I don't have that. So I made a guess at what something would be that would actually influence the rise of zippers and what that looks like. And I wanted to know when zippers were actually introduced. When were they patented? When were they made more widely accessible and available? And wanted to kind of add in something that says, why did that actually happen? What are things that might have prompted some of the bumps up that we've seen in the production and use of zippers? So I wanted to add some additional context in terms of the history of the zipper onto the chart itself to try to give some of those additional clues. And so as I was playing with that, I also thought that maybe it might be helpful to look at some of the data points and label them directly, specifically on the actual bars themselves, in terms of the starting and ending point, and then where we were before the initial patenting of the zipper as one historical point that may have influenced the availability of that product throughout clothing manufacturing. And I'm not an expert in supply chains, clothing manufacturing, or the history of the zipper, so take this as a hypothesis on something that could have had an impact. And interestingly enough, there were two separate filings for two different designs of a zipper, but that is something that I am not well equipped to go ahead and dive into the differential reasons why those were changed and updated. And as
Amanda, I'm just going to comment briefly. If people are wondering, well, wait a second, if the zipper didn't even come out until such and such, how can people from the class of 1899 be wearing? I will explain a little bit later. Sorry for the duration.
Well, and one of the challenges I had with the title on the original graphic was the hypothesis of, if Princeton University graduates are representative of the overall population, I would hypothesize that Princeton University graduates are probably better able to access innovations in clothing technology and things that might be more expensive than people who might be part of a broader population. But again, on the kind of things that maybe Steve can highlight for us as he dives into the history of the zipper.
Not nearly to the degree that you would be hoping, but continue.
And then I said, well, do I really need all of the fills in the background? So do we need the 100% fills? Do we need those components? And do I want to have all of the zippers on the actual columns themselves? I do not have Philip's same skills in Adobe Illustrator, so mine are a bit messier, I think, and maybe that adds to the messiness of what they look like. But I said, what if we go ahead and focus in on the fact that this is really focusing on the rise of the zipper at Princeton in terms of it being a Princeton-focused graphic. And so I moved my zippers to give some visual clues to the zipper being the thing that we were focusing on, to the background of the axis itself, and then also to looking at the two different points, noting the patent dates, just to kind of replace the reference lines with something more visually interesting, but focusing on the bars themselves in terms of the overall growth from when the zipper initially was introduced or started to be used over to what we saw by the end of the survey period. So focusing in more on the fact that this is survey data specific to a population at Princeton and not to a general population. So that was where my mind went as I went ahead and did that. I used the Princeton orange, which makes it very Halloween themed, I suppose, which is appropriate for October, but decided to go that route in terms of the visual display that I kind of landed on as my final design. Thoughts?
Bravo. Bravo.
Having worked with Amanda, I just want to call out, like, all this time, you do annotations so well. I just love how you annotate charts.
Thank you.
In this, in this case, not a lot of annotation, just a couple points, but it's like it provides interesting factoids to the biz.
But I'm confused by the zipper height at 1913 and 1918. I think I'm supposed to be looking at the height of these things and seeing 55% and 50%.
That's a good call out, because I did not associate that at all with the way that I was looking at it versus using the reference bar. But I can see that when you have the zipper along the axis as well. Yep.
Yeah. Had you just used the zipper over on the right, but this is, I'm with Jeff about the whole comment about the annotation, but I'm focusing on the height of the zipper there as opposed to that's when the patent first appeared.
Fascinating.
The only thing I would say is I might put a 0% at 1894 just to make clear that there's nothing.
Yeah, and I kept that in at the 0% here with that other piece. And to be frank, can't remember why I took it out, but labeling that first kind of point. But it's a great call out.
All right. Fantastic. Jeffrey.
Am I up? Let's see if I can get my mouse working here. Add to stream. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. I'm just going to call out to everybody, just so everybody on the call knows, we have not seen each other's stuff. This is the first time. So if anything looks similar, we did this blind, which, by the way, is not how any of us would design charts. I mean, if I were making something for a magazine, probably all four of them would see this before I put it in a magazine. But this is kind of going blind. So anyway, I was just going to jump right. I'm not going to go through my process. I'll maybe step back to that. But the original, this is where I ended up. I did try some of the same things that the other authors like. I have to say, for the data in and of itself, I think I probably would lean to the area chart. I thought the area chart with 100% that you saw Andy do, I thought that was a really, really compelling story. And of course, I did try zippers and various bar charts and other variations, but I ended up here. I took some liberties, of course, knowing, number one, that blue jeans were probably not popular until the 1940s, 1950s, even though they were invented in the 1800s. And I'm sure Princeton was probably not wearing blue jeans. So I acknowledge that, but I just thought that that would help get the story across. And I turned the line chart into a zipper, mostly because my wife said that had to be a line chart. That line chart had to be a zipper. So I spent some time in Adobe doing that. I did want to call out that because it was in black and white, I wanted to make sure that it would also work in black and white. So I did play around with that, just knowing that, because it was a sort of homage to the past. Yeah, that's where I ended up.
Jeff, I want to know about the liberties taken with 1940 to 1943, because I struggled with the challenge of that range on my last survey period.
I did too. And by the way, I mean, if I were making this for real, I mean, everything's in a 5-year increment, right? Until you get to the end, and then you're in a 1-year increment. I will explain it.
I have the answer to this, but sorry that I kept that from people. I wasn't trying to, keep this extremely valuable knowledge, but why that group was actually combined.
No, I don't necessarily care about the group, but just so you all know, like Steve combined all those, so it was 1940 to 43 as in one group. And what Amanda's calling out is I made an individual date for each one, and I did that on purpose to get the zipper to go across. I mean, it could have worked the other way. I could have just stopped it and just binned them like everybody else did. But that is an interesting call out, Amanda. I mean, I did break that out into 3 separate dates. And I think if I were really making this for real, I probably would just use 1943 and just cut 40 to 42 so that it's closer to the range.
Hey, I too made a compromise with the data. If anyone was paying attention, I just cheated on the last data point. So we've all made, but no one was paying attention at that point.
All right.
I'll say I did notice that. But I mean, the challenge is, I mean, Steve's gonna explain here. But I mean, these are college classes, which is the fundamental thing. The challenge with doing them all as one, it's one group and not 4 groups. So it looks as though there are 4 years that it was consistent in flatlining, which I don't think is the case. And so I think that's the challenge with breaking those out.
So when I read this in your newsletter and saw this thing, I'm going, who did a longitudinal study of Princeton graduates over a 50-year period to find out what they're wearing? So I ended up, in fact, purchasing the book and discovering, they didn't do a longitudinal study. It was reunions, which are very well attended, as I can attest. This is my alma mater. And they were polling people at these classes from the class of 1994 who were all there at reunions and asked, I don't know if they asked 5 people or 10 people, but that's why you would have people from the class of 1894, from 1904, who are in fact wearing zippered trousers, even if they didn't become mainstream until 1913 or whatever, because this event happened in 1943 or in 1944, probably in 1944 at reunions. And that's why you have 5-year increments. People only show up, come in droves every 5 years to their reunions. And that's how that worked. I don't know why it says 1940 through 43 and not 44, because the 40 it should say 41. You should have someone for 1939, and then you should have 40 through whatever.
Well, my assumption
44.
was they were talking to current students,
Right.
and so those were people who were graduating in 40 through
Yeah.
43. That was my assumption. on that.
Mine too.
So in any case, I'll show you what my experiments with this, which is the first one
Sorry,
was
Steve, we're just going to hijack the comments. Jeff thinks that you were part of the 1940 to 43 cohort. and let's hand it over to Steve to show us his makeover.
Wow.
Or did
okay.
you actually do the original? Is that what this is going to be
is-
about? You were the original designer.
And
Do we have clarity
and-
on this point, though, Steve, before you dive into your makeover, on is the chart about what they were wearing at that reunion or what they wore back in the day at school?
no, it was what they were wearing at that reunion that day. And they're asking people, or do you wear, do you have trousers with buttons? And someone from the trousers with zippers, and someone from the class of 1894. And that person is 72 years old at their 50th reunion at this point, says, I would never wear trousers with zippers. So that's how this thing transpired. Over a 2 or 3 day period, they did this polling. In any case, and yes, Andy, I would absolutely have hijacked my presentation to get Jeff's insult amplified as much as possible. So thank you.
Here to help. Yeah.
There we go. So here was so I did several forays into this. I did the crossing line chart, Philip Bump. I did the stacked bar chart adding up to 100. I did the area chart. Then I thought, hey, let me, go to the noun project and do a similar type of thing. And this is not my strong suit to make something like this, to say the least. But this is when I contacted Ali Torbin and said, hey, I'd like to buttress this. I have this notion of a zipper as a snake, like eating up buttons, and zippers are eating into them. Think of that "Don't Tread on Me" type of look from the Revolutionary War. And so I asked Ali, could you create a graphic that I would put at the top? And I showed her the thing and said, by the way, if you want to tackle the whole thing, and not just the gee, come look at me shiny object up at the top. So just to show you, this is the original, and let me show you what Ali came up with. And she wanted to really get the feel of it from the era, and I she really did a great job. It kind of looks like the House of Slytherin here, type of thing going on, but the zippers eating into the buttons. So I just thought that was pretty magical. So gosh, I'm blown away with the time and effort everybody kind of put into this somewhat frivolous example and had a blast with it. Any comments before we move on and look at, I want to leave time for the information is beautiful discussion. But Philip, I did want people to see, hey, you do a lot more than just, so I'm not going to do any comments on this and say, let's move on. But I do want to discuss this. Mm-hmm. So I started looking at some of your columns and how you will use data and visualization to underscore or amplify your arguments about things. So could you just give a little discussion about this one, and then I'll show the two charts that you have in it, Philip?
Yeah, so I was sort of intrigued. I read a lot about politics, and so I was sort of intrigued. I have family in Pennsylvania, and as the Mehmet Oz, John Fetterman race started to heat up, and there were all these allegations about Oz having these homes in New Jersey, which I assume people are familiar with, that there was this, it struck me, I don't remember where, I think I read someone had tweeted something like, well, of course, everyone in Pennsylvania is a Pennsylvanian. And it struck me as valid, like in contrast to, for example, Arizona. And so I pulled data on where people from each state had been born over time. And the first result of that was this chart, which you can show. there have been lengthy debates about where I've situated all of the states here. We don't need to have those now. But you can see here Pennsylvania is particularly in contrast to Arizona. That Pennsylvania has a lot of dark purple representing people who were born in the state, and that Arizona has a lot more people who were born elsewhere, which is that lighter purple. This goes over time. So the furthest right is actually the 2020 values for each of these. And you can see there's a year in which the data is missing over time. But you can see Pennsylvania and a lot of the other northeastern states or Midwestern states, really, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, a lot of those are places where people who lived there were born there. Whereas out west, you get a lot more of the people who were born elsewhere. California, is a lot of people who have immigrated to the state. So it really shows the patterns of migration over time as well. And then here's just the data for 2020 using one of our beloved pie charts, but in the same sort of outline of the United States itself. But there you can see how Pennsylvania differs from Arizona, which is the other, or Florida, for example, which are cited in the piece.
For the record, I actually like the pie charts here.
Panel of pies.
And just so for me, this was a real eye opener just starting to read your columns, because I had this notion of, oh, all right, you have one group of people who write commentary, and in your case is pretty deep political commentary. And then there's this is my notion. There's this team of other people who do all the graphics that are going to buttress these type of things. And I would imagine on some of the interactive things, maybe that's the case. But with you're making all your own charts, correct?
Yeah, I make all my own charts and my own interactives, yes.
And is this something that's just sitting in a library over at Washington Post that's like, oh, we need a tile map?
No, I made it. I went into Illustrator. I have a little Illustrator template that I use to make each of these things. I mean, look, here's the problem, and I'll admit this. It's not really a problem because it works for me, but I'm self-taught across the board. I said, I had this Perl-based website back in 2000, and so I learned how to do these things very quickly, not using R, not using Tableau, but using Illustrator and using a clunky sort of old school way. So I can do them very quickly, and I have templates and I have shortcuts to do so. But it's not terribly replicable, unfortunately. And so, but I can't think of a time when I've done something that hasn't been something that I myself have done.
That was a big eye opener for me. Any comments from colleagues?
We did have one person asking, what tool do you use? Is there anything else in your stack besides Illustrator that you use as part of doing your work, Philip?
This one was literally, I had, an Excel spreadsheet that had the data over time, and I was just cut and pasting a table for each of these states and then just formatting the colors. I mean, it's clunky. Like, could I automate it better? Yes. But, again, I myself am automated at doing it fairly quickly, so it's easier for me that way.
Philip, how much iteration do you go through, or is there not really so much time for it? You're producing things on a daily basis, aren't you?
Yeah, no, I mean, if there are, so for example, yesterday I did a piece that was looking at how the newly drawn city council districts in Los Angeles overlap with race. And so I did a few iterations of that because I realized part of one of the things that I do is as I do the charts, I learn the story I want to tell a little bit better, right? And so I had this idea of what I was going to do with these data about the council districts in Los Angeles. I made a chart for them. As I was doing that and writing the story, I realized, actually, I only need to highlight these particular things. And so I did 2 other versions of that particular chart and ended up with one that just shows, instead of 3 points, 2, and instead of using a stacked column chart, it just uses arrows, and it just really simplifies it. So it's sort of it is a process, but yeah, it's very quick. This is not, I don't go to other colleagues and be like, what do you think of this? And sometimes I'll do a chart and people are like, this is terrible and I can't read it. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's totally fair. And I'm sorry. And I do my best. But yeah, I mean, I think we all miss, and I sort of take some comfort in that.
All right. I do want to leave a little time to discuss the Information is Beautiful Awards, Amanda, and then we'll come back to Philip and remind people where and how they can get the book, how people can join the after party, and how people can sign up for the next chart chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. So the Information is Beautiful Awards, some of you may be aware, are back They were around from 2012 to 2019, hosted jointly by the Information is Beautiful team, led by David McCandless and by Kantar, and sponsored by Kantar. This year, we are bringing them back as the Data Visualization Society with the support of David and his team, which has been great. And I'm really excited that we've released the long list, which includes nearly 1,000 different data visualizations that were submitted that had been created over the course of the past 3 years. So you can go into the entry showcase here on the IIB website, and you can go through and browse and look for inspiration from previous years and previous winners, and also click on 2022 and see everything that's been presented. And you can drive down into some of the special and new categories. For example, there's an entire category as our special annual category dedicated to the data visualizations of COVID-19. And so you can take a look at these kind of special categories and the new category for business analytics. So if you're interested in business analytics, diving into those might be also of interest. Would love to hear from my colleagues. IIB being back has been a big undertaking for the Data Visualization Society. I cannot overstate the amount of time that our team members, both volunteers and some part-time paid support, has put into organizing and coordinating the awards. So I'd love to know, is it worth it? Are you finding value in seeing the awards come back?
100%. Yeah, I'm a big fan, and I was so excited to see it come back. Glad you expanded the years to count for all those years that it wasn't running. I think it provides inspiration to us all. I mean, if I think about my two favorite times of year, it's seeing the long list and seeing the Iron Viz submissions. It's like those two chances to see everybody, submitting things that I found visualizations in there that I hadn't seen. Like, right, you can't possibly see all those things. And the special shout out, I hope the business analytics is here to stay. There weren't as many submissions in other categories because it was probably brand new. And I think we have to figure out as a industry, how do you present your business data that is probably proprietary and get it in a format that you can share it, in the IIBA awards. But I hope to see, lots and lots of participation of that in the future. I'm so excited about it. So thank you, Amanda. Bravo.
Sure. And I would give a shout out that right now we are still taking nominations for 3 of the special awards that are also new this year that were added to go ahead and reflect some of the asks for other really valuable things we do in our community as an organization. So for the inspirational and impactful community leader, the exemplary book, and the Test of Time awards, you can find information about those at the link that I'll post in the comments. But would still love to get some nominations for those. If anyone that you've worked with has inspired you and you think is an impactful community leader or written a great book, this is a great chance to recognize them and support them.
Okay, I promised we would, let me go back to sharing stream. So please check the links out. Please check out the Information is Beautiful awards. And here is the title and the cover of Philip's upcoming book. If you're asking for a link, look, it's not that difficult. Just type into Google Philip Bump book and you will find it. Same with, I was originally going to have some nice short link for the newsletter, but if you just type in how to read this chart newsletter, you will find Philip and how to sign up for the newsletter. Now, I did say that I was going to, if there was enough time, I would show this. We'd have a couple of things to show. You all know what a bump chart is. Well, maybe you don't. You should look it up, but it's kind of showing ranking of things over time. I wanted to share, I've created the Philip bump chart. Well, it's actually a Philip bump chart dashboard. So I looked at this. Imagine a pie chart that shows visuals at 42%, numbers at 36%, stupid jokes at 15%, and random complaints at 7%. Now let's convert that to a bar chart. And how many times have we had discussions about how pies and bars should work together? So here it is, visuals, numbers, stupid jokes, random complaints, and I can highlight any element and see the part to the whole relationship. So I have the best of both worlds going on here. And if I want to know, hey, I want to add up random complaints and stupid jokes and numbers, I can see that makes up more than 58% of Philip Bump. So there you go. All right.
Well, to be fair, that's of the newsletter. I feel like I have a lot more stupid jokes and random complaints than I do.
Well, we think the newsletter is, even Andy commented that it's really tinged delightfully with just the right amounts of humor. So I think 15%, 12 to 18% is the amount of humor that you want to have.
Well, I didn't include good jokes. We'll put that in visuals or numbers. How's that sound?
Couple more brief plugs here. I have a workshop coming up about the big picture, November 30th through December 1st. You can find this at bigpic.me/November 2022, the after party, where you can weigh in and share your thoughts of this. Sadly, Philip cannot join us. He has to prepare for the January 6th hearings. I do question his priorities, but I'm sorry you can't join, but we can have a lively discussion. So please join us at bigpic.me/after34. And our next chart chat, and it sounds like we're going to have RJ Andrews as our guest, will be at bigpic.me/cc35. I'm going to head off right now. And Amanda, if you could wrap things up. Philip, thank you so much for being our guest and for this wonderful newsletter that I look forward to getting it every every Saturday. I look forward to getting the next iteration of it. And thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to beg off right now and start the after party. Philip, good luck.
Great. Thank you, sir.
And we'll also go ahead and wrap up, sign off, and say farewell. Thanks again, Philip, for your time today. Andy, Jeff, and I will hop over to the after party. Philip, best of luck with covering the coverage for this afternoon. And we'll look forward to hopefully seeing more folks who enjoy Chart Chat also signing up for your newsletter and enjoying it the way that the rest of us do as well. So with that, we'll wrap up for Chart Chat today. We'll hope to see everyone in November and have a great rest of your month.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.